Two black cats. One weighs more than a grown man. The other weighs about as much as a bag of sugar. Geneticists comparing their DNA expected the coat to be the easy part of the study, the one thing that obviously matched going in. It didn't work out that way. In one case, the black coat turned out to be the single least related thing about the two animals. In another case, it turned out to be almost the exact same broken gene. A black panther isn't one animal. It isn't even a species, whatever the name implies. In the Americas, a black panther is almost always a jaguar. In Africa and Asia, it's almost always a leopard. Two completely different animals, on two different continents, sharing nothing but a nickname and the fact that both of them, occasionally, come out solid black instead of spotted. Somewhere in a flooded forest in Brazil, a jaguar the color of wet asphalt slides into the water to ambush a caiman twice its own body length. Somewhere in a rainforest in Malaysia, a leopard just as dark moves through the canopy so quietly that camera traps sometimes miss it walking directly underneath them. And somewhere on a couch, a black house cat is doing none of that. It's asleep, on its back, taking up an entire cushion. The assumption going in was simple enough that nobody thought to question it. A lot of people don't even know a black panther is a color, rather than its own species, an animal separate from leopards and jaguars entirely. Its own line on the family tree. It isn't. But even once you clear that up, the deeper assumption still holds on. It's built like something out of a nature documentary. It hunts in total darkness, kills animals many times its own size, and moves without a sound. None of that sounds like it belongs to the same category as the thing curled up at the foot of your bed. Part of the confusion comes from where most people actually encounter one. Not in a Brazilian wetland or a Malaysian rainforest, but behind glass at a zoo, labeled simply Black Panther, with no mention of which species is standing there. Two visitors can look at two completely different animals, a jaguar in one enclosure and a leopard in another, on opposite sides of the same building, and walk away having seen the same thing. The label does the same flattening work the word panther does everywhere else. But the coat itself really is identical between them. Solid black, same texture, the same faint ghost pattern of spots visible only in direct light. And if the coat is identical, the obvious guess is that whatever gene switches a spotted coat into a solid one should be doing roughly the same job in both animals. Same result, so probably the same cause. Here's how you actually check that. You don't look at the color. You sequence the gene responsible for it in both animals and compare three things: which gene it is, what kind of mutation it is, and whether that mutation works the same way. A dominant mutation only needs one copy to show up in the coat. A recessive mutation needs two, one from each parent, or it stays completely hidden. Some mutations delete part of a gene outright, removing the instructions entirely. Others just disable the gene without deleting anything, leaving it intact but useless. Two identical black coats can come from two totally different genetic accidents, or from the exact same one. Looking at the fur can't tell you which. Looking at the gene can. Start with the leopard. Melanism in leopards traces back to a gene called ASIP, short for agouti signaling protein. It's a recessive mutation, and specifically a nonsense mutation, meaning it inserts an early stop signal into the gene's instructions, so the protein never finishes being built. A leopard needs two broken copies, one from each parent, to come out solid black instead of spotted. It's common enough in the dense, wet rainforest of parts of Malaysia that in some local populations there, close to half the leopards are melanistic. Now here's where the assumption should hold, and doesn't quite the way you'd expect. A domestic cat's solid black coat runs on that same gene, ASIP, not a similar gene, not a related pathway. The same one, in the same general spot on the genome, just with a different specific mutation doing the breaking. A leopard in a Malaysian rainforest and a black cat asleep on a couch are disabling the same genetic switch to arrive at the same color. So the next assumption writes itself. If the leopard and the house cat share the gene, every black panther probably works the same way. That's where it falls apart. Switch to the jaguar. Melanism in jaguars doesn't touch ASIP at all. It runs through a completely different gene, MC1R, the melanocortin-1 receptor gene, and it works in the opposite direction entirely. It's dominant, not recessive, so one copy is enough to turn the whole coat black, which is part of why melanistic jaguars, while still uncommon, aren't nearly as rare as you'd expect a random mutation to be, showing up in something like 6 to 10% of wild jaguars across their range. And instead of disabling a protein the way the leopard's mutation does, this one does the opposite. A small deletion, just 15 letters of genetic code missing, makes the receptor overactive, flooding the coat with dark pigment instead of failing to produce it. The leopard goes black by breaking a switch. The jaguar goes black by jamming a completely different switch permanently on. Two different genes, two opposite mechanisms. Two animals people casually call by the exact same name. If the black panther in question is a jaguar, it has essentially nothing in common, genetically, with a black house cat's coat. If it's a leopard, it shares the gene but not the specific mutation inside it. Same word, same result. Two entirely different answers depending on which continent you mean. The jaguar's genetics come with one more detail that has nothing to do with color, but everything to do with what that MC1R switch is attached to. Jaguars have the strongest bite, relative to body size, of any cat alive, big or small. It's strong enough to punch straight through a turtle's shell or a caiman's skull, rather than suffocating prey the way lions and tigers typically do. That trait didn't arrive with the black coat. It was already sitting on the jaguar's branch of the tree long before any individual jaguar happened to inherit a melanistic mutation on top of it. The coat is recent. The skull is ancient. They just happen to be riding around in the same animal. There's a name for what's happening with the coat specifically. Convergent evolution, the same phenomenon that shows up again and again across the cat family whenever two lineages land on the same visible trait through completely separate routes. Neither the leopard nor the jaguar inherited black from some shared black ancestor. Each one broke or hijacked its own pigment system independently, on its own timeline, because being harder to see in a dark, wet forest is useful enough that evolution keeps reinventing ways to get there. Which raises the obvious question: if black keeps getting reinvented, how many times has it actually happened? Across the cat family as a whole, researchers studying coat color genetics have traced melanism back to at least 5 separate, independent mutations. The jaguarundi has its own version, a different deletion at a different spot on the same MC1R gene the jaguar uses. The Asian golden cat has its own separate mutation, in ASIP, distinct from the leopards. Even the oncilla, a small spotted cat from South America, barely a third the size of a leopard, has turned up with fully black individuals in the wild in recent years. Black wasn't handed down through the family tree once. It was invented from scratch, over and over, by different branches solving the same problem in different ways, the same pattern that produced spots on some branches and stripes on others. To understand how far apart these particular two animals actually sit, you have to look at when their lineages split, and it isn't just a species-level split. It's deeper than that. Leopards, jaguars, lions, tigers, and snow leopards all belong to one genus, Panthera. Domestic cats belong to an entirely different genus, Felis, alongside wild cats, sand cats, and jungle cats. That's not a difference in species. That's a difference in genus. One full taxonomic rank higher. The same kind of gap that separates humans from chimpanzees, rather than the gap that separates two kinds of humans. The leopard's branch and the domestic cat's branch actually separated somewhere between 6 and 8 million years ago. For comparison, modern humans and chimpanzees split from a shared ancestor around 6 million years ago. The leopard and the house cat have been running separate evolutionary programs for roughly as long as we've been separate from chimpanzees. Every trait either animal has picked up since that split: its size, its habitat, its hunting style, and yes, its own specific black coat mutation, developed independently, continents apart, with 6 to 8 million years sitting in between. The jaguar's branch split even earlier, alongside the rest of Panthera, crossing into the Americas roughly 6 to 7 million years ago, along a land route that no longer exists. There's a physical difference that tracks the exact same split, and it has nothing to do with color either. Jaguars can roar. House cats cannot, no matter how hard they try. The difference sits in a small structure called the hyoid bone, which anchors the base of the tongue and throat. In roaring cats, part of that structure is flexible cartilage instead of solid bone, which lets the larynx drop low enough to produce a deep, rolling roar. That same flexibility is part of why they can't purr continuously, the way small cats do. A house cat's hyoid is fully hardened, rigid from one end to the other, built for a completely different kind of sound, a steady, uninterrupted purr instead of a roar. It's a small skeletal detail buried in the throat, but it lines up perfectly with everything else. Different branch, different toolkit, all the way down to how the animal is even physically capable of sounding. The roar itself turns out to be less reliable a marker than it first looks, which is its own small warning about trusting appearances. Snow leopards sit in the same genus as jaguars, lions, and tigers, Panthera, the roaring branch of the family. And yet snow leopards don't roar. Their vocal structure is close enough to the rest of Panthera to place them firmly inside that genus genetically, but not quite close enough to produce the same sound. They chuff and yowl instead. So even, can it roar, isn't a clean stand-in for, which branch is it on? It's just one more trait that turns out to be more complicated than the label suggests, the same way the coat is. The domestic cat's own history adds one more layer that makes the gap even stranger. Genetic tracing of house cat ancestry back to its source found that every domestic cat alive today descends from a wild cat population in the Near East, first domesticated roughly 10,000 years ago, traced back to at least 5 separate wildcat founders from that same region. That timing lines up almost exactly with early farming communities in the Fertile Crescent, starting to store surplus grain, and without meaning to, attracting the rodents that needed hunting. Some of the same researchers who mapped the wider wildcat family tree were involved in tracing that domestication story too. So in a real sense, the house cat's own origin and the rest of the family's origin were untangled by the same hands. 10,000 years since the house cat's ancestors started sleeping near human grain stores. 6 to 8 million years since it last shared any common ancestor with anything wearing a black panther's coat. Those two numbers aren't remotely the same order of magnitude, and the coat sitting on top of both timelines looks, at a glance, identical. So if the coat isn't fully shared, and the roar isn't shared, and the timeline isn't close to shared, what's actually left? Here's the one place the genetics do line up, and it isn't the color at all. It's the machinery sitting underneath the color. Every cat in this story, the jaguar sliding into a river in Brazil, the leopard invisible in a Malaysian canopy, and the house cat asleep on a cushion, is still running on the same ancient predator template. Fully retractable claws, kept sharp because they never touch the ground while walking. Forward-facing eyes built for depth perception, for judging exact distance before committing to an attack. A reflective layer behind the retina, the tapetum lucidum, the same structure responsible for a cat's eyes glowing back at a camera flash or a set of headlights, built to catch every remaining photon of light after dark, letting a house cat see clearly in conditions a person would consider pitch black. That entire toolkit, the claws, the eyes, the low-light vision, the whole ambush hunting body plan, was already finished before the leopard and the house cat split apart at all. It predates the color by millions of years. It predates the roar. It predates every specific coat mutation layered on top of it since, which flips the entire question upside down. The trait everyone assumes will match is the coat, because it's the one thing you can actually see with your own eyes. But the coat, in this story, turns out to be a repeatedly reinvented feature, rebuilt from scratch at least 5 separate times, on separate branches, using separate genes, sometimes matching by coincidence, and sometimes not matching at all, depending purely on which continent you happen to be standing on. The trait that actually holds steady underneath all of it is the one nobody thinks to ask about, because it's invisible unless you go looking for it. The claws, the eyes, the basic hunting machine both animals were built from, long before either one had to decide what color to wear on top of it. Run the whole comparison back, and it reads almost like a checklist of things that don't add up the way they should. The name matches. The animal itself doesn't, not even at the level of genus, one full rank higher than species, the same size of gap that separates us from a chimpanzee. The color sometimes matches, depending entirely on which black panther you picked, jaguar or leopard, and picks a different answer each time you ask. The bite doesn't match, not remotely, not even close. The roar doesn't match at all, not even a little, and never will, and even inside the roaring branch of the family, the roar itself isn't as consistent a marker as it sounds. The timeline is off by a factor of roughly 600 to 1, 10,000 years of house cats sleeping near human grain stores, against 6 to 8 million years of two branches doing their own thing on two separate continents. And the one trait that does match, quietly, completely, without exception, across every single lineage in this story, is the one part of the whole animal that has nothing to do with why anyone called it a panther in the first place, and nothing to do with why anyone calls the other one a house cat. The next time a black cat crosses in front of you, in a nature documentary or in your own kitchen, the color is the least interesting thing on it. It's a costume, reinvented from scratch at least 5 separate times across the family, switching hands between different genes depending on which branch happens to be wearing it that day, sometimes borrowing the exact same broken switch a different species already found, sometimes building an entirely new one instead. Underneath the costume, in every single one of them, jaguar sliding into a river, leopard invisible in a canopy, or the cat currently ignoring you from across the room, is a machine that was finished a very long time ago, in a place neither animal remembers, running on parts that were never once redesigned, only recolored, over and over, on branches that stopped speaking to each other millions of years before either of them had a coat worth arguing about.